Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, it's summit season in Europe. We're talking about how India voted at the United Nations Security Council. First up, it's summit season, like we just said, in Europe. And not the big peak kind, but a far more dangerous variety, as the United States and its allies try to band together to protect the global dollar hegemony and continue in their attempt to establish a unipolar world order. NATO members met in an extraordinary summit in Brussels that the US President Joe Biden said he had called to extend sanctions on Russia. The United States, the European Union and their allies have unleashed several coordinated waves of sanctions since Russia began military operations in Ukrainian territory a month ago on the 24th of Feb. The NATO summit was followed by a meeting of the leaders of the group of 7 nations, which are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United Kingdom and of course the United States. That meeting was also attended by the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The G7 warned Russia against the use of chemical and biological weapons, but we are unsure at this point whether there's any evidence of the deployment or the potential use of such weapons at all. And finally, in a late-night address to the European Union summit, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky thanked European leaders for adopting, I quote, powerful sanctions against Moscow, but urged them to go further and break the pattern of being a little too late. Poland and the Baltic states called on Europe to follow the US in restricting Russia's energy trade, but they faced resistance from other member states who are not so keen to jeopardize both their energy security and hurt domestic customers. Pravir Purkayastha, NewsClick's editor, is now with us to make sense of what's going on in Europe and this hectic diplomatic season that we're in the middle of. Pravir, how do these summits connect? Of course, like we were talking earlier, the players, the actors and the play in many sense is the same.
Yeah, whether you talk about the G7, you talk about the European Union, or you talk about the NATO, it's all really a few set of players who are setting the terms of the debate. Others are following. So it effectively means the United States, who has de facto, if not de jure, the chief architect of all of this infrastructure, and the others are following behind, talking about a rule-based international order, where the rules are really set by a few countries, which I will call, unfortunately, the settler colonial and the ex-colonial countries. And it's a kind of white boys club that we see when they get together, except Japan forms the, in a lot of these discussion forms, what would be called the honorary white club, which is what they were under even the Pretoria, South Africa's apartheid regime declared to be. But if we look at what is behind that, we don't really see anything new. We don't see either anything new in terms of trying to reach a agreement by which peace can be established in Ukraine. We don't see any possibility of that. In fact, we see really the pressure being mounted more on Russia. And in that sense, a hope being held out to Zelensky that if this continues, at some point Russia will buckle down, so he doesn't have to really sue for peace. So essentially what we see in this is the belief that Russia at some point will actually surrender. Now that's not likely to happen for various reasons. Militarily, this whole picture, they seem to have convinced themselves that militarily they are winning. Militarily the Ukraine is winning, Russia is losing, which is not really the picture at all. In fact, there are very serious reports emanating from within the Defense Department in the United States, which questions this kind of summary conclusions, particularly if we say what Russia's aims are, which is to break Ukraine's military rather than take over Kiev or other population centers. So if you take that, then the eastern Ukraine becomes really the main theater. And if that is so, then it does seem that the major part of the Ukrainian army, which was there, is likely perhaps to be destroyed or incapacitated over the next few weeks. It was never going to be shock and awe because, after all, it is not a country they can bombard like the US could bombard Iraq. No consideration for its people. And even then, let's not forget, Fallujah took them quite some time to handle. And by that flattened Fallujah completely. And of course, number of people killed there were quite high. That is not the way Russia is moving, which is what the Newsweek's article, which quotes some unofficial Defense Department source to say. It seems to be a leak purposely engineered to puncture the kind of we have won bragging that the United States media has been making. So that is one part of it. The second part is the economic issues, and I think that's a bigger problem which they don't seem to have addressed properly in this 3 summits.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, critical not just for the economy of Russia, but all of Eurasia and the world at large. We, of course, I mean, this might be vaguely anecdotal, but the people making the most amount of money in Russia also do happen to be Americans. So this is not, the economic impact is not of sanctions is not restricted to Russia alone. How are you seeing peace talks proceeding? Because we are 1 month into the conflict, and there's literally no movement on that front, and it seems to be that the stakes are being upped constantly without any backing down on any side.
I don't see at the moment peace talks going anywhere, because Zelensky seems to believe that ultimately he will get the European Union or the NATO or the United States impose sanctions or act militarily in order to have Russia back down. That's not likely to happen. And militarily, I think that they're some way getting convinced by their own propaganda, and that's a very dangerous issue. You can do propaganda for keeping up the spirits of your people alive, but at the same time, you have to have a clear idea of where the military balance really is lying. And I don't think they are doing that, because they believe that NATO will finally come to their aid. And if that happens, we are looking at a world war. So, and if you look at a world war with nuclear weapons, let's face it, there is no point in discussing any of this, because nothing will exist. So that is one part of it. In terms of economic issues, really the point that arises that they have seized Russia's money. If that is so, if a country has a surplus in terms of trade, and that trade surplus, say I trade with you and is with you. Now, if you can seize it, it effectively means I've given you goods for which you haven't paid me. Now, that's the situation. And at the moment, they have been continuing to do so, meaning that if they buy Russian gas in euros or in dollars, then if that money doesn't go back to Russia, it means that Russia is just supplying gas without getting any payments. And this is what Putin has now said, that we will take payment only in rubles. Now, how that will work out is not clear. Does it mean, therefore, what Eve Smith runs a website called Naked Capitalism, and she's a financial expert. She says it is counter sanctions, that it can only be done if the banks who are sanctioning Russia, Russia Central Bank and other banks, they then actually lift or weaken the sanctions by then keeping an account in the Russian banks in euro, in rubles, and only then they can get access to rubles. I don't understand this very much. Does it look like, reading what people are writing, they understand it very much either. Because this is a completely new scenario where you have international currencies which were supposed to be sacrosanct. You could keep your balance in either euros or in US dollars, and suddenly they're no longer yours. The money that was supposed to be yours is no longer yours, it's been seized. So given that scenario, the only other possibility then could be in other international currencies like yuan and so on. But sanctioned entities are still there. So Russian entities are sanctioned. What do? Even if they touch another bank, even a Chinese bank, that Chinese bank comes under sanctions. So whole infrastructure that has to, of economic infrastructure, financial infrastructure has to be rethought. And countries like India, we buy 85% of our hydrocarbons from it's either oil and gas. We buy it from the international market. And a large part of it could come from Russia today. If there is a shortage and the price goes up, we are going to be affected as well. So how does this whole market really work? We are not clear at the moment with this kind of sanctions. It's like the Americans and the Europeans have taken a crowbar to the financial market. How it will reassemble, we don't know. But it is quite possible that the dollar and the euro hegemony that existed before this is actually going to be over, because there is no way countries will now trust the euro or the dollars and the surpluses people had in this central banks in the for the future. So I think we're looking at a completely different scenario and how it will happen. But at the moment, we are looking for shortages in oil and gas, and the hardest hit will be European Union. For shortages of wheat and other food products, fertilizers, I think we're going to see a huge impact on countries like Africa, where particularly Arab world, where there is a net shortage of food.
Right.
So countries like India also are going to be hit because our prices are going to go up. So I think we are looking at both shortages and price going up, and this is the condition of what is called the stagflation. Is the worst that can happen to the world. I do not see that any of these issues being addressed by the so-called summits that have taken place.
Next up, Prabir, we're going to be talking to Prashant a little bit about India, how India voted at the UN Security Council, as well as the meeting between India and China's foreign ministers that's ongoing in New Delhi. But before we get into that, is there any scope in what is being seen as a largely European conflict for players such as China, India, to get involved and broker some kind of at least dialogue?
At the moment, that space doesn't seem to be there. It's become either you are with us or against us. So that's repeatedly what we see, what we can hear from particularly the United States. And let's face it, this is one case European Union is losing its autonomy and surrendering it in front of the United States, because after sanctioning Russia, the only possible source of oil and gas they can get is probably United States. So this is where they are at the moment. Doesn't look like they're going to get much traction in West Asia at the moment. Venezuela is out. Iran is out, apart from being a part of West Asia. So they're really then depending on the United States. So given that, I do not see any autonomy, even the autonomy they had during the height of Cold War, when you had Willy Brandt established what he called his Ostpolitik, that even that is not there today. So at the moment, we see really a surrendering of the European Union and its autonomy in front of the United States. And that is, I think, one of the consequences of what has happened, that you will see a different architecture of the world. What's going to happen is Western Europe, I think, is going to become increasingly less important, and euro as an independent currency, I think, is now going to be much weaker.
Serious issues for Europe, for sure. Thanks very much for that, Prabir. Right, so as I was saying earlier, Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China arrived in New Delhi unannounced, even as the militaries of both India and China are in the middle of a 22-month-long standoff along the line of actual control. It's a ongoing territorial dispute. This is the first high-level visit from China since the Galwan Valley incident back in 2020. The visiting Chinese minister met both the National Security Advisor of India, Ajit Doval, and Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. Earlier, India was among 40 nations, close to 40 nations, which abstained in the UN General Assembly on a resolution moved by Ukraine that held Russia responsible for the crisis in that country. First up, the United Nations, Prashant. How have countries been voting? What kind of resolutions are being proposed? And particularly countries of the global south, how are they voting?
So there are a variety of stances actually. India's stance, for instance, especially interesting because it abstained on the Ukraine moved motion, which talked about the humanitarian crisis, blamed Russia for that. This was, of course, proposed by Ukraine and its allies in the West. Many countries in the global south abstaining on that resolution, nearly 40 abstaining, although 140 supported it. Only very few countries, India and China both abstained. Very few countries like Syria, Eritrea supporting that resolution, supporting Russia on that in that case. But simultaneously also, if you look, India also abstained another resolution moved by South Africa, which talked about again the need for about the humanitarian crisis, the need for peace, etc., which did not name Russia, and which was, however, not adopted by the assembly or taken up because of it's a procedural vote, because the fact that there was not enough support for it. So India is each of these countries, I think, playing a specific game based on in their senses their own set of interests, especially economic interests. Now India is delicately poised because we know that on the one hand it has been a part of the Quad, the US-led alliance in the Indo-Pacific region. It was always fairly enthusiastic about the policy of encircling China as long as when the US is committed to it, still is. And so there is that thread, so to speak. On the other hand, India also has very close relationships with Russia. So he does not want to antagonize Russia. We're talking about military relationships. We're talking about, say, fertilizer supplies. We're talking, and India has also bought. Indian companies have bought Russian oil after the sanctions have been imposed as well, and there is the discussions on to buy the Russian oil in rubles as well. So sort of creating the base for a different structure of purchasing oil. So there is this entire relationship which is very very much there. So India doesn't want to upset that either. So it's been taking a very careful stance. Earlier this week in the Security Council as well, it abstained on on another motion which Russia had moved, trying to talk about the humanitarian situation there as well. In that resolution, all the countries except Russia and China abstained, and so that didn't get passed either. 9 votes are required in the Security Council. So, and if you look at the earlier votes, again, the Security Council, the General Assembly, at the IAEA, all of these resolutions India has taken specifically this stance. So, on the one hand, we have seen a lot of pressure from the West. We have seen various Quad members having meetings. Japanese Prime Minister was in India. Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, had a summit with Modi. Victoria Nuland from the United States, the key person in the Ukraine policy, was actually in India. So despite all this pressure, India has definitely chose to stick to its stand. Many other countries also doing very similar things depending on where their economic interests are. And I think this kind of shows that while the West wants to portray this notion of this united globe against the evil Russians, so to speak, and that's really not how it's working out. The Western European countries and the global North, so to speak, that way, are very much more or less on the same page when it comes to this. But when it comes to countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America, their interests are more diverse. They realize that the economic scenario is far more complicated. They also see that there is a kind of decoupling, what has been called the decoupling, that's in process, where the Russian and Chinese economies are moving closer, and they are perhaps separating from the global North economies, and the countries countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have important trade relations with Russia and China as well. So they would not want to spoil those kind of relationships by taking up, joining the Western bandwagon on this matter. So a very interesting time ahead. I think that many of these countries will continue calling for peace, of course, which all these countries are calling for, but not on the terms in which the West is doing so. And I think as far as Russia is concerned, it will definitely appreciate these kind of stances as well, because and continue to engage with many of these countries. We're also seeing some of the same questions being raised about the West Asian countries, which have been having their own dynamic with Russia, although they're always considered to be stooges of the United States. On this matter, they have kept a bit more of an independent line, because they have their own demands. So let's be clear, it's not that they're not going to listen, they don't want to listen, or it's out of any ideological or philosophical notion of independence. They have their own demands of the United States regarding the war on Yemen, regarding maybe on Iran for that matter, so which they want to, regarding their own domestic politics, for instance.
So it's very much a quid pro quo
Exactly. So we see multiple, I think, channels and positions in international politics, which actually speaks to the diversity of interests and how complicated this entire issue is.
Taking off from that, Prashant, India and China, of course, India is a slightly smaller player, but still an important global player. Their foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi, talks that assume far more importance than just bilateral relations between those two countries. What happened there? Ukraine likely to be high on the agenda there as well.
Right. So we don't have a full version of exactly what has happened, because we have had the Indian statements, which of course echo the Indian line. We haven't had too much information from the Chinese side on what was really discussed. So what seems to be clear is that I think there is an attempt to sort of take the process forward from both sides, which is very good, because, but nonetheless, there is a significant fact that the border issues, which 2020 you mentioned, the incidents of violence which led to deaths, for instance, on the Indian side, we don't know the exact numbers on the Chinese side, but of militaries, of soldiers. So this has started a round of tension which has really not subsided. There have been multiple levels of negotiations at the military commander level, but there's not really been a solution found to this. And I think India and China have slightly different positions on what to do on this. India wants to keep this issue central. They are very clear that unless this is resolved, there's no point really in
other conversations.
So other conversations are peripheral. China seems to say that let's talk about this, but also let's keep this in the along with a number of other issues which we should discuss about as well. And that seems to have been China's push as well.
Right.
I think this visit was marked by the Indians also discussing other issues, but that difference in difference in priorities, I think, is still very much there.
Right.
So the media reports at least say that many other issues of bilateral interest were also discussed between the Indians and Chinese. Some of them are fairly urgent ones. On Ukraine, like we've said, their positions, for very different reasons, from very different perspectives, seem to be aligning much more than on many other issues that are there, which is very interesting to watch. So keeping all this in mind, I think it is, I wouldn't say the visit was unannounced, because there was speculation from quite some time that Wang Yi would be landing up in New Delhi. It was not clear if it was 100% confirmed, but there had been reports that he would, because he has been visiting all the capitals in the region. I think he went to Bhutan next, if I'm not mistaken. Or Nepal, yes, exactly. Right. So, interesting moment of engagement. We need to see, of course, whether this will, this will carry on, lead to further discussions, whether this will strengthen the discussions at the commander level itself, lead to some kind of agreement, which is very essential right now for the region, because we don't want, nobody wants tensions between two very powerful countries in this region. It's very dangerous for everybody concerned. Also, there is scope for cooperation in the areas like Afghanistan, for that matter, in areas in Central Asia itself. There's a lot of potential if there is the possibility of agreement, but all that depends on whether pressing issues can be agreed upon as well. So the Ukraine war, I guess, providing some amount of background as well for a reevaluation from both sides regarding how things should be taken forward. So interesting times ahead.
Interesting also to see that he went on to that Wang Yi went on to Nepal after that. So
exactly,
South Asian dynamic also
right,
coming into play.
Right.
But we'll keep that for a different show. Prashant, thanks for that. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. For more details on these stories, please head on over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and please give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back for our final show of the week tomorrow, same time, same place. See you then. Goodbye.